think this is a nice segue into the kind of substance and structure conversation, because it's causal, right? It's a causal chain that we're trying to find the beginning of. Yeah, either you have nothing and then somehow magically causes start from that nothing, or you have something, which we evidently do, like we said. And there was always something. And in that somethingness has some kind of primal mover, or something that can start the causes. Or if it's not like a primal mover, what would it be? It would be kind of self-caused, or
yeah, I would think if it wasn't what we might think of as a prime mover, I would think it would have to be something like everything that could ever exist is always entailed and contained in something that's sort of self-sufficient and necessary and cannot be other than it is. So one way of thinking about it is obviously, like you said, a prime mover, which is like something that's self-sufficient sort of starts a chain of dominoes, right? And that the dominoes keep falling over, but the reason a chain in that respect makes sense is because it begins with something that isn't part of the chain, right? Something that grounds the chain, something whose existence just is, basically. And that's one way of thinking about it. That's traditionally the theistic conception, God, right? God creates the world because he himself does not stand in need of creation. So that's how, that is usually made sense of. But the other way of thinking about it is what the somethingness, which necessarily is of such a nature that it just always contains everything that's possible, I suppose.
Yeah, so in that sense that all of the possible, it's kind of like a infinite possibility space, or
Something
or
like
even if we're just including the possibilities of our universe, and it's a specific possibility space of some kind. But yeah, the way that you described it earlier as kind of like this, like using abduction, right? We're trying to find these general rules of sorts, and we're looking at the puzzle pieces in order to try and understand, there are these general rules that fit outside on these edge pieces. I kind of like the idea that it's kind of like a fundamental archetype of some kind. It's kind of like this rule that persists throughout the system in some way, and that's why we can know it, because we can see it playing out in its different forms within the middle pieces.
Yeah, there's something like the most general principle that's like holographically distributed throughout the whole, or something like that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads in nicely to this idea of substance, right? Like a substance is kind of, and I like the analogy that we've used in our educational video, which maybe we can link up here, is that of clay, right? Like whatever you make out of the clay the substance of the clay, the material of the clay remains clay, but you've shaped it in a specific way. And the clay has different properties, but the structure is kind of the way that it emerges in, let's say, space-time, and if we're going back to our kind of fundamental features of reality.
Yeah. And I think substance and structure is a really interesting duo to consider in the context of something like a dual aspect monism, because, most people carry around an intuition that, well, however sort of multifarious and numerous all these things appear, they all kind of fit together into one world. That's what makes the puzzle analogy, I think, so compelling, is that, puzzle all is individual pieces, but the intuition is it all goes together, and in fact, in some sense, it never was broken apart. It already is and always is one thing. Existence itself, or the thing in itself, or, a theist might say God. But substance and structure is really interesting in that respect, because it seems that neither one of them can exist without the other. That you can't have a substance without it having some kind of structure. Then you kind of just get some. It's almost impossible to imagine. Like clay, but the clay's not in any form whatever. It's not just a lump, because obviously a lump is also, it's got some structure to it, right?
Mm.
It's like clay, pure and simple. It's like, what the hell is that?
Well, it reminds me of kind of like a Platonic form of some kind. It's like just the idea of a possible structure of some kind.
Yeah. But interestingly, obviously, form form is actually the same as structure. Form is just a way of characterizing that.
Right.
But similarly with structure, you can't. It's impossible to imagine having a structure without it being the structure of something. Like structure in its very nature is something that inheres in some substance, and obviously Plato had that, and had the concept of, well, what if you had just structures in themselves, but that it's a very interesting idea, really great proposal, in terms of getting Western philosophy and Western metaphysics off at a running start. But I think there's lots of problems that are attendant on that idea of separating substance from structure. And I think that's one of the reasons that Aristotle's reaction to Plato's philosophy was to move towards a particularity-centric philosophy that takes individual instances of things, in some sense, as fundamental, and forms as being sort of functions of those individual concrete things.
And then in some sense, what we're trying to do now is kind of find some unity between the two.
Yeah, to find that kind of middle way, something that validates the insights of both, that substance is clearly, I think, essential to what it means to exist, but so is structure. And in fact, it's very difficult to imagine one being subordinate to the other, because in some sense, it's like, I often think of it in the analogy of like gluons, like you can't pull them apart. The very energy you put into pulling them apart generates a new pair, and so there's, in some sense, the whole idea of getting one on its own is like a non-starter, I guess.
Yeah, it's a nice way of putting it. So with the talking about substance and structure, I know that there are various philosophers. Process philosophy is sort of almost the rejection of, or they would put it in their own terms, the rejection of substance. But I almost get the sense that they're trying to make structure primary, or trying to posit what they would call structural relationships as the foundation. But to me, it just makes sense that the structure is, and like the form of the substance is relational, and that it is dynamic. It's not like a static thing. It's wrong to imagine that the substance is like a metal, and that the structure is going to be a solid crystal form of some kind. Like that's a possibility, but it's so obviously relational. If we do any looking around in the world, that it doesn't make sense to think of the substance as static, as some kind of inherently isness or beingness. And we said before that there's some potential there, like there's this infinite potential, let's say, and it's married to inherently the structure. Yeah, maybe we can go a little bit into more about that relationship. Like what is it that makes substance and structure make sense of something like process philosophy, or as opposed to like a static substance? Why is a static substance not okay?
I'm not sure that I'm sold on the idea that there's something inherently problematic with a static substance, to tell you the truth. To me, I think of, just as I was sort of saying about substance and structure being like of the sort that you really can't separate them, I think this is another problem that's attendant on this idea of dynamic versus static, And I've often had a kind of a lingering question mark in my mind when I engage with process philosophy, which is, what is a process really, right? A process is sort of, there are certain constraints, and then the process sort of is responsive to, it's like the realization of the set of constraints sort of going together. But the constraints themselves, I think on pain of circularity, there has to be some constraints governing process in general that are static. Like, it seems to me
Right.
like dynamic and static, it's all, so when you could think of like, okay, it's all static or it's all dynamic, and both of those seem equally unacceptable hypotheses. All dynamic, all change. Well, change then doesn't change. Like, there's something in what we're calling change. The very fact that it's always changing, right? That sort of phrase betrays the idea that there's something in that is not changing, namely the state of always being changing.
Right. So it's almost like a misnomer of some kind to consider the wrongness of the static substance, because even that claim is some rule that must be inherent to the
Exactly,
thing that is
exactly. And the whole idea of, I guess, everything is in process. It's like, I think that's a very useful way of contextualizing, especially certain phenomena, like living beings and the frame of mind, phenomenological reality, say. But it also seems to me that there have to be some things that are definitive of the process that can't themselves be in process, or we kind of get another infinite regression where it's like, okay, so there's constraints, then they're changing according to a process. That process is governed by constraints, and back we go.
Yeah. No, and I think it'll be interesting to talk to some more knowledgeable process philosophers about this
Yeah.
stuff. But yeah, there's definitely, in at
And
least my limited reading.
we do have plans to get
Yeah,
one of those on the channel soon. So
yeah,
eyes
I'd love to
peeled.
chat to him and get some clarity about this. But yeah, my limited reading is that it's just the issue of process philosophy still appears when they posit like God and a kind of abstract realm of absolute objects, as Whitehead puts it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't see the difference between that and the kind of what we might consider a substance.
Exactly, yeah. And that's one of the areas of process philosophy I'm most interested in, is what, they call process theology, because that's, I think, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of, okay, does this ultimately cash out in something that is purely processed through and through, where there's nothing static? I find it very difficult to make sense of how that proposal, once we get down to that sort of fundamental thing, that's because the idea of a process theology is some absolute, right? And sort of what we were saying before, the very nature of an absolute is to kind of be something that cannot be other than it is. So, to be necessary, to sort of, yeah. And so I guess I have a difficulty imagining how you make that something that's inherently in process, as opposed to, say, the arbiter or first mover or some orienting principle that is not itself in process but constitutes the whole nature of what we would think of as process.